Welcome to Luke21 Radio, a broadcast explaining biblical prophecy in the tradition of St. Augustine. And now, from Greenville, South Carolina, here's your host, Steve Wood.
Hello, this is Steve Wood, and welcome to Luke 21 as we study biblical prophecy together. And as we study biblical prophecy, we're just not looking for some facts to stuff in our heads, but we want to have the truth that the scriptures teach in biblical prophecy impact us in practical ways that actually become a part of our lives. So today, I'm going to be starting with the application because I get so wound up in what I'm teaching, I don't have time to get to that. And today I have a special handout for you. But let me tell you first, it's kind of a little bit of a hot topic. My episode title is How Christian Youth Come Under Babylon's Influence. And Revelation 17 and 18, we saw there's this worldwide influence of the great harlot, Babylon the Great, and the whole nations of the world have been drunk on the wine of her fornication. Now, that's Revelation 17 and 18. I'm going to explain what that means. But first, the application on BibleForCatholics.com, we have an updated handout for intelligent design entitled Resources for Teaching All of Life is the Work of a Designer. And we have had that handout up there for, months, and it's a free download. But if you look under the title, it says updated March 2026, and we have updated that with some important resources. And we have resources on intelligent design that basically all of life is the work of a designer from kindergarten to PhD level. So it's all there. We prepared it for you, and that's your application for today. So let's dig in. What is this? A great harlot, a prostitute, enticing the entire world population and making them drunk with the wine of fornication. What is this talking about? Well, this is actually common prophetic vocabulary. It's used widely in the Old Testament that to commit idolatry is like the root sin because what you're doing is you're switching from faithfulness and allegiance to the true God to something other than God and almost pretending or maybe even worshiping that something else as God. So that's idolatry. It's an apostasy. It's a falling away from the faith. And the prophets in the Old Testament, and here John in Revelation 17 and 18, use the word like for sexual immorality of some kind. Fornication, very often in the Old Testaments, they would call this apostasy or turning away in idolatry from the true God. They would call it adultery. In other words, they would use sexual immorality terms for the idolatry. And in our last episode, we saw something pretty important, that as soon as Aaron made the golden calf, committed idolatry, Moses was up Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, the brakes were released for sexual immorality. In other words, if you worship the true God, there are brakes to keep you from descending into degenerate behavior. And we read in Exodus 32, as soon as Aaron made the golden calf, the next day they worshiped it, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The Bible is not like the Oprah Winfrey show, just putting anything out there. It's very discreet in its euphemisms. This was a wild Mardi Gras party, and it was sexual immorality. It didn't start with, see, we have chastity talks, and we wonder why they don't work. It's because idolatry precedes the immorality. That's where it comes from. Now, I am going to be sharing, and I know I'm trying to clear the way in a sense that this doesn't apply to everybody because there's some very great exceptions. But there's a huge, big mistake made by Catholic schools, Catholic colleges, Catholic apologists, Catholic media, Catholic teachers, Catholic youth leaders over the past century. And this is something that's widely used, not by everyone. As I said, there's good exceptions, but widely used. And I'm talking about theistic evolution to try to explain to young people how the world got to be the way it is. And I wasn't a Catholic at the time, but from much as I can tell, particularly about the time of the mid-20th century, around the 1950s and the 1960s, Catholic high schools and colleges increasingly were teaching evolution in biology classes. And they taught Darwinian evolution with, I call, a few lame qualifications, because Darwinian evolution believes an unguided process through random selection can account for everything we see on life on Earth. Theistic evolution says God somehow guided at times this unguided process. If that sounds like a contradiction in terms, it sure is. And the trouble with theistic evolution, it's essentially evolution with a little theistic tacked on. Now, I can understand if you were a teacher, preacher, apologist, youth leader in the 1950s or even early 60s, and Darwinian evolution is steamrolling through our culture and our educational institutions, and you didn't quite know how to counter it. Well, I could understand why you would try to have theistic evolution, although it isn't a very strong position. In fact, there's a number of Catholic educational institutions that basically say they're teaching theistic evolution, but you can go into a biology class of colleges in the Newman's Guide to Faithful Catholic Colleges, and they'll never mention the theistic part of evolution. They're simply teaching atheistic Darwinian evolution, okay? So that's not a good strategy, and particularly if you're teaching it today, I think there's no excuse, because what happened in the 60s? Well, DNA was discovered, and Darwin, there's a great book written about Darwin called the Darwin's Black Box, and Darwin's black box was the cell. And Darwin, in his day, and no fault of his, but he didn't know what was in the cell, so he just assumed it was a simple cell. And we now know there's no such thing as a simple cell. It's highly, highly complex. And there's no way in the world, no matter how many billions of years you give it, you can't come up with one strand of DNA through random mutations, okay? So that's not going to happen. But what I want to talk about today, and I've given you a handout with all the information for intelligent design, again, from kindergarten to PhD level and everywhere in between. But today I want to show you what happens, the consequences when you move from a creator to a, what I call maybe a semi-creator. It's not working, by the way. Theistic evolution convinces those trying to convince young people, but it doesn't convince young people, believe me. But what happens when you make the switch from a full-blooded belief in the Creator, which in our creeds is the foundation of belief? Well, Romans 1, starting with verse 19, is really indicative. And St. Paul in Romans 1 is saying how the Gentile world got to its degenerate state. And I'm going to try to show you, using St. Paul in the first century Rome, how the United States of America got to its degenerate state. Romans 1:19, he starts off with, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, like sunsets and mountains and rivers. For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, that is, God the Creator, or give thanks to him, because they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. See what happens if you leave belief in the Creator and you start giving great honor and even worship to secondary things. The mind becomes darkened. In Revelation 17 and 18, it talks about the nations of the world coming under the influence of idolatry, and they term it as drunkenness. When you're drunk, you're under the influence of alcohol. But what happens, their minds become darkened. Now, when that happens, there's consequence number 1. And this is verses 24 and 25. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the Creator rather than the Creator. The creature rather than the Creator, excuse me. Now, what happens? We make the switch from Creator to theistic evolution, which is just an adjective tacked onto evolution, basically, and it's teaching evolution, and somehow God intervenes here and there, but it's not teaching a Creator. That's your 50s. That's when it starts, and then you have the Woodstock generation pop up, because once they do that, the consequence number 1 is sexual immorality. And everybody's trying to stuff that back in the box with theology of the body, lectures and tapes and CDs and books and all this type of thing, and chastity talks. But starting with belief in a Creator is the number 1 step in a worldview. And in my worldview series, I showed you the statistics that worldview affects sexual morality more than moral teachings to youth does. So worldview is essential, and if you don't have worldview, the worldview fundamental, just like in our creeds, is God is Creator. The consequence is sexual immorality. Then it goes on. So you have consequence number 2, starting in verse 26 of Romans 1. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. And because they didn't see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a base mind and to improper conduct. You want to know what happened after the Woodstock generation? It was, San Francisco, and the lesbian and homosexual revolutions that we see going on as a phase 2 of the sexual revolution that didn't start with the sexual revolution. It started with a denial of God as Creator. And then you move to number 3, Romans 1:32. Even though they knew God's decree that those who do such things deserve to die, they do not do them, but approve of those who practice them. And the United States Supreme Court on June 26, 2015, with the majority opinion written by a Catholic, making Genesis 19 marriages the law of the land. So we go from the sexual revolution to the Genesis 19 revolution to the Genesis 19 marriages approved by the United States Supreme Court. But it began with a denial of the full belief in God as Creator. Parents, be sure to get your hand out. I'm Steve Wood, your host, and you've been listening to Biblical Prophecy with Luke 21.
Luke 21 is a radio outreach of Family Life Center International. To learn more about biblical prophecy, visit us online at Luke21.com.